Hi, I'm Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville, and to be the vice chair of the Senate committee that oversees all of Maryland's election legislation. Welcome to this week's episode of Kibitzing with Kagan. My very special guest today is Wendy Underhill from the National Conference of State Legislators. Thank you, Wendy, for spending time with me today.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here with you, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Let's start with just 2 seconds on NCSL, what it is and why it provides such an important service to legislators around the nation.
Sure. The National Conference of State Legislators is the nation's bipartisan organization supporting the work of legislators and legislative staff. And you can tell I've said that more than once. There are over 7,000 legislators and over 25,000 staff. They are from both parties and some independents as well. And we support the work of all of those, and we do so in a confidential way. And much of the information that we provide, all of the information we provide is nonpartisan. So that's our role, is to support the work that you do.
And you've been there now for 12 years, and I have been lucky enough to be starting my 8th year of working with you on this legislation. And so I am grateful because you're a wonderful resource and a great partner. So thank you. So we are taping this on January 6th, and I'm just going to start with this mask, because one of the most important parts of, in my opinion, of being an American is voting in every election all the time, well-informed, and our laws make that easier or harder. So why don't we start with just talking about January 6th and what that was for you and where we are in terms of elections right now.
Well, sure. So this morning when I got up, I listened to the radio, and I listened to Fox, and I listened to NPR. And on Fox, I heard the phrase "an ill-advised protest," and on NPR, I heard the phrase "a subversion." And I'm not sure that they used insurrection, so I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth. But that was interesting, that we all experienced something that was gut-wrenching a year ago, and we are feeling the reverberations now, and we will be feeling the reverberations into the future, because the policies, the discord that January 6th represented has not gone away. And so one of the major issues is not so much about what are the details on how we vote, it's on whether people trust that the vote can be counted, and whether those other folks in those other states have elections that can be trusted as well.
Right. So for anyone who's watching this way down the road, it might end up being forgotten what the provocation was for January 6th. And it was challenging the election outcome. So let's start. We have, and you and I have talked about this many times, there is a real gap between red states and blue states, and whether their legislatures are closing the door and making it harder for people to vote, or whether they are opening things up. Working for a bipartisan organization, how do you navigate that? How do you coach people?
Well, I want to first actually push back just a little bit about that analysis. If we look at what happened in 2021, there were 3 more states that went to all-mail elections, which many people would identify as making it easier to vote. And there was another state, Kentucky, added early in-person voting, and several states upgraded or added online voter registration and automatic voter registration. So there were this year a lot of enactments that were on what many people would think is the more voting side. And there were actually fewer enactments, in my opinion, than the press would have you believe on the other side. Okay. There were bills on voter ID that strengthened it in several states, and Montana and Arkansas are coming to mind right now. Mostly, though, I think on voter ID, states have gotten to the right place for them, and 35 states have a requirement for someone to show an ID when they show up. So there's not a lot of room.
Not Maryland. Not Maryland.
Right.
We're a bit of an outlier still, because not everyone has easy access to identification.
Absolutely. I understand the position that if it could be seen as a barrier to voting, you don't want to have it. I'm just merely saying that thing that tends to, that policy choice that tends to be favored by conservative legislators didn't move hugely this year, nor were there huge reductions in the amount of early voting. Iowa went from 29 days to 19 days. Is that an infringement on the right to vote when other states don't have any early voting? Hard to call it that.
Sure. Good.
I know you want to know, well, then what the heck is going on? So I can just keep going.
Go for it.
Well, so the things that were new this year, and I think are an outcome of the furor over the 2020 election, were that states said, we're going to pay close attention to who's running our elections.
Yep.
And several states did enact new laws that put fees or crimes associated for local election officials who might not be in compliance. Now, nobody wants election officials who aren't in compliance with the law.
Right.
But yet this year there were these new attempts to put some extra teeth or in that kind of a thing.
So I'm not worried about teeth. I'm worried about death threats. I'm worried about elections officials who are just civil servants who are trying to support democracy, having their families taunted, threatened, stalked. Talk about that.
Absolutely. It's been shocking to the elections community. There have been more retirements or resignations than ever before. Not only was the 2020 year a really stressful one trying to run elections in the time of COVID, but then to be under such fire on social media and in real life as well. So in fact, there's several different resources on what that's meant for the election officials community. And what will it mean going forward? Will we need to be recruiting new people? You don't just wake up one day and know how to run an election. There are a lot of details in it. So that is problematic. On the legislative side, I saw several bills that were enacted that make it a crime to impersonate a local election official. That's good. But only one bill that I see last year that would particularly call out election officials as a protected class of people. I might not have the phrasing quite right on it. It was out of Washington State. It might be something that you'd be interested in, and maybe it'll stay alive for next year. I don't know, but it could be that what we've now learned, that local election officials are endangered, just like nurses are, just like firefighters and police are, just like postal carriers are right now. Civil servants are facing some tough times.
Great.
And what will be the answer? I don't know.
Yeah. Let's talk technology.
Mm-hmm.
So technology can be our friend or it can just drive us nuts. How has technology made elections easier or better? And then if you can briefly flip to the other side, which is how are elections endangered due to technological developments?
Oh, what a great question. On the front end, it's convenient if you can register to vote online, which is true in about 42 states right now, I think. It's convenient if you can request an absentee ballot in the states where you don't have to have an excuse. You can go online and ask for it, and it'll come in the mail. Mm-hmm. It's convenient if when you show up at a polling place, there's an electronic poll book where you can write in your name or even swipe your driver's license, and there you are, ready to go. These are good things.
Interesting. I didn't know we don't do that in Maryland. That's anyway, moving on.
Okay, well, we can look at that. Yeah. There's even ballot tracking where there are systems where you can know. I get texts when my ballot has been mailed to me, when it has been received back in the office, and when it has been authenticated. So that's a way tech can help us. Mm-hmm. But when you're talking about the flip side of this, we do have bad actors. I think that's the phrase. I think that's the term of art, and they could be international or they could be domestic, who might want to mess with our voter registration rolls. So every time you add technology, you have to add layers of security to that. And most states are pretty clear that they don't want the actual votes to ever be out there on the web anywhere. Registration has those portals. Election results are submitted to the Secretary of State electronically, but the votes themselves are separate and secure. And this is something that I guess I feel a little bit like there's so much attention on other things. I wish we could put a little more attention on the cybersecurity aspects of elections.
Absolutely. Before we pivot, one of the new developments that is an issue that NCSL helped me learn about was RCV, ranked choice voting. Why don't you talk about that? Explain what that is briefly, and how do you see that in the future? Do you think it's going to catch on?
Well, I'm going to say that it's a trendlet. So not quite big enough to be a trend, so it's a trendlet.
Okay.
Ranked choice voting means that instead of saying, I vote for this candidate, you say, I like this candidate best, this candidate second best, this candidate third best, and sometimes it could go on and on and on from there. And if you choose the candidate, your number one candidate gets knocked out on the first, if none of the candidates got over 50% of the vote, then the candidate that received the fewest votes is removed from the race. The other ballots are recalculated, and you do this again and again until somebody is over 50%. So there's a lot of confusion about, there's a lot of talk about whether this process is confusing. And unfortunately, the New York City mayoral race last year did look confusing.
Not helpful. Yes.
But on the other side, we all do understand, oh, you're out of chocolate, then I'll take vanilla. We get that kind of concept. And I think a philosophical question that legislators could be asking themselves is it okay to elect someone with 30 or 35% of the vote, or do we want them to be favored by over 50%? And if the answer to that is yes, RCV is one way to get there. Using runoff elections is another way to get there. But it's just an interesting thing that there's something behind the scenes there to consider.
No, I agree. I think it's fascinating. I haven't been able to sell it yet in Maryland, but we're going to continue to work on it.
Yeah, I will say, Senator, that it's mostly been tried out in local jurisdictions, cities and such. Only 2 states are doing it nationwide. So I would not say that. The first state is Maine, and the second one is Alaska. They've just adopted it and will be using it for the first time in 2022.
Didn't Utah just do RCV as well?
Utah has permitted their local jurisdictions to choose to do it, and most of them, I shouldn't say that, I know, I'm not quite sure. It's a choice, and many of the cities and counties are using it.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So before we pivot to redistricting, you and I have spoken many times about my work on 911 because 3 people have died in my district when 911 has failed. And one of the key aspects of saving lives and property through next generation 911 is GIS, the Geographic Information System. And you believe it has an important application for elections. Can you talk about that?
Yes, and thank you for teeing me up so nicely on that. I want to say that I think GIS for elections is something that could be of interest to Democrats and Republicans and all of the nonpartisan people out there, because its goal is way at the beginning, before you've even decided who are the candidates who are going to run. GIS can help make sure that every voter gets the exact right ballot that they should get. And that's because they're voting on things based on geography. What district are you in? What Senate district are you in? What congressional district are you in? What fire district are you in? And that's determined by where you sleep. Where's your head at night? Okay. And so you could think of people as being pins on a map. You could think of the districts as being maps. And if you can put that all together through a geographic information system, you will have far fewer people who get the wrong ballot. And there have been examples where these errors, and it's 10% of people are in the wrong precinct to sort of on average around the nation. If you can clean that, that doesn't mean 10% get the wrong ballot, right. But it does mean that there's little slop in the system. You can take that slop out. You can start your elections with great security and accuracy and then move forward. So I think it's a coming thing, not just for 2022, frankly, probably not till a few years down the road, but I think it's going to be coming.
Yeah, we are, transitioning to next gen 911 and updating the database is time consuming and expensive. So it's definitely not around the corner, but it'll be interesting to stay connected and learn about that. So,
and if it were possible to connect next gen 911 with elections, that'd be great. Maybe. And you might even have some property tax type people who want that kind of information so that they can be a little cleaner on who's getting charged what for taxes. I don't know. I think it's got lots of possibilities.
Fascinating. Thank you. So let's talk about redistricting. So I'm sure that anyone watching this podcast knows this, but I'm going to do 2 quick sentences on it is required constitutionally that every 10 years, every decade, that all the people who live in America are counted and counted accurately and fairly. And that data is used to draw our congressional district lines, our state legislative district lines, and has an enormous impact on the allocation of federal funding and state funding for various causes and needs. And so the collecting of data is challenge 1. and making sure we're doing it in wealthy areas, poor areas, including everybody, counting everyone, whether or not they speak the English, whether or not they're documented or undocumented and all that. And then, so that's super political. And then the drawing the lines, super political. How does a nonprofit bipartisan organization like NCSL support the process? And how are you coaching 50 states on redistricting?
Well, again, a good question. On the census part, our role has been to have a very close relationship with the redistricting data office within the Census Bureau. So those folks from the Census Bureau come to every single meeting we do ever, and they ask questions and they answer questions, and they will be willing to stand at the front of the room until everybody's gone home. They're the last people standing.
Nice.
And they did the very best that they could in this last year. There's never been a perfect census, and last year's wasn't perfect either. Let's hold that for another one.
Yes.
So that is done by the way, it's the largest non-military endeavor that the federal government ever does. So great big deal.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
I think yes, paying taxes or collecting taxes, actually, but yes. Okay.
So then on the redistricting side, our role is to make sure that legislators, and generally speaking, it's legislators who do redistricting, understand the federal underpinnings of redistricting and understand their own state's requirements. And that varies from state to state. But as you know, the baseline is we do this for one person, one vote. So we have equal population districts, not geographically equal, population based equal. And what I notice now that I've been through this process is we're at the front end. We're the educators in advance. You come to our classes or our seminars and you can learn about what are some of the sticky things ahead. But then the minute that data dropped from the Census Bureau, we could sit back and just watch the action, frankly. States have their own attorneys who they're turning to, the Democrats and the Republicans.
Right.
And they're doing their deal. We did testify in many states this year about, again, sort of the 101 of it. But in the end, you got to then go out and do that work. And again, it's usually legislators who are doing that work.
So my wonderful congressman, the nation's wonderful congressman, Jamie Raskin, one of his many memorable statements was that voters should pick their elected officials rather than the elected officials picking their voters. How is that possible to give American citizens the reassurance that that is the way it's happening? Because it doesn't always happen that way.
So it's always been a political process. They've called it a political blood sport. When you've got policy, then you've got power, and then redistricting is behind that. So it's pretty darn hard to separate it out. And it's pretty darn hard to find these mythical, nonpartisan and also educated people to draw the lines.
Yes.
So many states, no, some states have changed from the legislature being in charge to some kind of a commission.
Yep.
And there are a few that have used some randomness in the selection of their people. And perhaps those are the ones that come closest to being independent redistricting commissions. NCSL doesn't really use that word because it's always connected in one way or another into the legislature, at least a little bit.
Right.
But at any rate, you can try to do that. And this year, there are 4 of those states that I would say that are using an independent commission, and we'll see how well they do. That's Arizona, California, Colorado, and Michigan. We'll see whether their maps stand up in court better than the maps that are drawn by legislatures.
So let's talk about court challenges, because no one is ever going to be happy with the maps, as there's no such thing as a perfect map. And so some party or some interest group is always bringing court challenges. Can you speak to that? What do you think is reasonable? What do you think that these courts should be looking for?
Well, I do think it's to be expected that your maps will be challenged. Maryland has a long history of that.
Yes.
One way to sort of reduce the likelihood of that is to, sure, stand up for your team, but don't be greedy.
Right.
And so whether people choose to, how you define what's greedy and what isn't, I don't know. But I mean, if you're trying to squeak out every last little drop for your party, that's when you're more likely to be challenged in court. So that question is likely to come up in state courts this year, because the federal the Supreme Court has determined that partisanship is not something it's going to be able to unwind for the states. So it's up to states to think about on that with their own state courts. But there's also, race is always an issue when you're talking about redistricting. We have the Voting Rights Act. We must provide districts from which minority populations can elect the candidates of their choice. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be more than 50% of the people in that district, but you can't not look at race. At the same time, you can't build districts that are based on race. So that's a juggling act that I think you've been through and know what that feels like to try to thread that needle.
So first off, we're not allowed to talk about the Maryland map. So I am not looking to have a Maryland conversation at all, which I know you wouldn't be doing anyway. But how can we give voters, I don't even know how to ask this. The problem is that when people look at the maps of our country, I mean, other than in the far Midwest, are not squares. Other than, North Dakota and Kansas and in Wyoming, I mean, we don't have a lot of perfectly square jurisdictions. And so when you're looking at county lines or municipal lines or state lines, they're ziggy and zaggy. And so the maps reflect that. But when a reporter or an activist looks at a map with ziggy zaggy lines, they say, oh, it's gerrymandering. Can you talk about what gerrymandering is and when it is that, and when it's kind of not? It's just, that's where the boundaries are. That's where the river goes. That's where the city limits are.
Well, and so you know this stuff so well already, but gerrymandering is sort of a informal word for drawing the maps in a way that benefits your team. And that could be, and usually is Democrats versus Republicans, but it could be a racial gerrymander. It could be a gerrymander that favors incumbents, whether they're your party or the other party. So we don't like to use that word too much either. But if you don't like the way the maps were drawn, you say they were gerrymandered. And if you do like the maps, you say, what a nice job of redistricting they did. Right. But every state, even those square ones, they have some mountain ranges or rivers or other things that provide sort of natural boundaries that aren't going to fit the squares. And you do want to make districts that have some common ground. And you do want to try to keep counties whole if you can, cities whole if you can. Some state constitutions are clearer about that than others, but you're starting with a mishmash of entities, all of which are weirdly shaped. And so if you look in and you see a odd shaped district, it's worth asking, what was the intent behind drawing that district, rather than assuming that because it's odd shaped, it's malevolent in its intent.
Yes, good. Very well said. Thank you, Wendy.
Sure.
Before we shift to Fast Five, are there any other things you'd like to talk about in terms of either elections or redistricting?
Wow, I should have been prepared for that question. I guess I would just say that something that maybe is broader than both of those is this question of misinformation. How are we getting our information? What are the guardrails for accurate information? And what can lawmakers at the federal or the state level do about it? It's very hard to tell, because my truth is your slur. How do we know what is a true statement? So I think that's not just in legislatures, in everybody, in every nook and cranny in the schools. That's something we're going to be talking about for the next several years until somebody figures it out.
Who knows if we'll be alive when that happens, but yeah. You referenced federal legislators, and I actually don't know the answer to this. Does NCSL engage with Congress? And if so, in what way?
Not much. Let me try that again. That's because I sit in the Denver office, so I don't engage with them much. Let me try again. We do have a satellite office in DC.
Yes.
And if we have policies that have been adopted by NCSL, we can lobby on those. And a policy, for instance, around the census is that we support adequate funding for the census.
Yep.
Then you could argue what's adequate. We generally support allowing states to make their own choices. And we definitely oppose unfunded mandates from the federal government on down. But I'd say 3/4 of our policy staff is in Denver working with the states, and 1/4 is in DC, keeping track of what goes on, because so much that happens at the federal level has a huge impact on states.
No question. And before we pivot, I just want to say how valuable, I mean, I already gave you the shout out, but NCSL hosts these national legislative conferences, and they are so helpful. Sharing best practices, learning about a huge array of issues, swapping ideas with legislators in other states from your party or from across the aisle, and I love them. And if it weren't for COVID, you know, I didn't miss this one, but you know, last year. But I'm hoping to be in Denver this year in 2022.
Well, I'm glad that you're coming, and we'll make it fun, and we'll go out and visit a local election office, and we will be sure that you get a little taste of all the many policy areas outside of elections and redistricting as well.
Perfect, perfect. So Wendy Underhill, National Conference of State Legislatures, Fast Five quick questions to let people know a little bit more about you. So question number one, since we are soon after the new year, tell us something great that happened to you personally or professionally in 2021 that you'd like to share.
I got to tell you, Senator, I am so into my work that I'm going to give you a work one. I'm sorry.
Right.
And that is that when we did our final in-person meeting on redistricting in Utah in July, I was so thrilled to have 400 people there, both parties. Nobody mentioned President Biden or President Trump during the whole 3 days. That was a huge success.
That is amazing. Question two, what is your favorite aspect of your job?
I like being in touch with legislators. I also like many of the other pieces, but when I can have a one-on-one conversation with a legislator, I feel like I've earned my keep that day.
Love it. And I've been the recipient of that, so I'm lucky. You've got an English lit background. Number three, what is your favorite book? Something that inspired or moved you in some way?
I don't know if this is my all-time favorite, but I just drove from Denver to Boston with my oldest daughter, and we listened to Emma by Jane Austen in the car, and we would hit pause as often as we wanted to and talk about it. And so for right at the moment, I'm a Jane Austen fan, and particularly Emma.
Love that. That's great.
Yeah.
This is a new question that an intern of mine came up with. So you're the first time being asked this. Would it be your preference in a theater to be on stage, backstage, or in the audience?
Oh, that's so hard. I want a minor part on stage. I don't want to be the lead. I want to be one of the dancers in the background, or the kitchen maid. Yes, Mom.
I love that. I love that. And the last question, the one that I ask everyone, Wendy Underhill, NCSL, what is your hidden secret superpower? What is a skill or talent you have that most folks can't do?
Well, I'm going to say that I am good at making conversation with just about anybody. And that matters on this job. I kind of want to say people tend to like me, but that sounds braggadocio. So I'll just say I can make conversation with anybody.
Well, I think people do tend to like you because you are lovely and smart and wonderful and responsive. And it is such a pleasure to work with you, Wendy. I look forward to being vice chair on the Elections and Redistricting Committee and working together and continuing to learn from you in the years to come. Thank you so much for taking time to Kibbitz today.
You're welcome. This was a real delight. Thank you.
Take care. Stay safe. See you soon.